What's up YouTube? Today I want to do something a little bit different. I want to dive into the world of video game sound design. So I'm going to be approaching this, from the very basics. For those who might be tuning in from a kind of game design development background, less of a kind of musical background, I'm going to kind of go through the basics of synthesis and all sorts of stuff like that. And hopefully by the end of this video, you guys will be able to create your own unique sounds using software synthesizers for use in games or all sorts of stuff. You could use it in music, I guess. So anyway, let's dive in and have a look at some of these principles. So I should probably mention I've been working on a simple game to use as a kind of example for this series. It's a very simple platformer game that I created in Unity using a couple of tutorials that I found on YouTube, and yeah, it was amazing actually what I was able to create, very, very quickly. So you probably recognize this little character from previous thumbnails on my videos. I basically just kind of converted this guy into a little animation, made him run around a little level here. The thing is though, without the sound, I find that games are particularly boring. Sound plays such an important role in creating immersion that you don't quite get the full effect of stuff like explosions and, in terms of the background music, you don't feel the threat level as the kind of like tension in the music rises and that kind of thing. So let me just give you a quick example of what the game looks like without sound. Bear in mind, it's very, very simple at this point in time and still needs quite a bit of work. The idea is you trying to get as high as possible while eliminating enemies that are spawning randomly. The higher you jump, or the higher you sort of progress in the level, the more enemies are being spawned, the quicker they come at you, and the more of them are being spawned closer to you, and they sort of progress towards you quicker. As you can tell, the immersion levels are pretty weak at this point in time. There's no sort of explosions, gunshots, and as I'm getting higher, I'm not feeling like the difficulty is increasing, even though it's quite obvious that more of these enemies are being spawned all around and all sorts of stuff like that. So anyway, so this is a VST plugin called Vital. For those who don't understand kind of DAWs and VSTs, this is basically like a plugin that you load into a digital audio workstation. I've chosen Cubase, but you don't necessarily have to go with Cubase. There's various free options, Reaper, and various other options that you can go with. Essentially, the digital audio workstation is kind of like your application, and Vital is kind of like a plugin that you load up into the application to actually synthesize stuff. So you don't necessarily have to use Vital, but the reason I'm going to use Vital is it's so visual that it makes things a lot easier to understand for those diving into synthesis for the first time and that kind of thing. And it's also very, very capable of synthesizing a huge variety of crazy sounds. And there is a free version as well. So for those who aren't serious about music production and that kind of thing, it's a great option for just, fiddling about because it's not expensive. That being said, there are a couple of options in here in the paid version, like text-to-speech, which might be incredibly useful for those who are doing video game sound design in case you're wanting to create robotic dialogue and all sorts of stuff like that. So anyway, we're going to dive a little bit into that a little bit later on, but I just want to kind of discuss the basics of synthesis, and I think this is the perfect plugin to do so. So I've got a USB MIDI keyboard, and that allows me to trigger notes that the plugin actually plays within the DAW. That being said, you can actually draw in MIDI, and that will then trigger the synth to do certain things within itself. So let's say, for example, I'm just going to draw in a MIDI clip over here, and you'll see when we click those notes, it actually triggers different keyboard notes. So keep that in mind. If you don't have a MIDI controller, you can trigger the notes here at the bottom, or you can trigger them inside the DAW, or most DAWs have a QWERTY keyboard to MIDI converter, so you can actually trigger the notes with your computer keyboard, which makes things a little bit easier. I find having a more tactile thing than it makes the sound design process a little bit quicker rather than having to click and do something and then click to audition how it sounds, if that makes sense. You can kind of hold a note and move something like, and you immediately hear the response. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to keep things relatively simple, and I want to talk about some of the most common waveforms or generators that you will generally find in a synthesizer. So in Vital, how you find that is you click on this little init thing at the top of this waveform window, and you choose basic shapes. And these are essentially a bunch of the basic wave shapes that you would generally find in a synthesizer. You've got a sine wave, a slightly more distorted sine wave, a triangle wave, a saw wave, a square wave, and a more pulse modulated square wave. There are other ways of generating sound. I mean, you have a noise oscillator, which you can load actual audio samples into, you know, like drum sounds and all sorts of sound effects, which you can load in there and apply certain parameters to kind of resynthesize the sound. So Vital isn't as advanced in terms of the sampler capabilities as some of the other synths and stuff on the market. Something like Phase Plant and that kind of thing. If you are into more sample manipulation, something like Phase Plant might be a little bit more suited to your workflow. But that being said, it's just because it's free, I'm going to stick with Vital for this video. So let's jump back to Oscillator 1 and let's have a listen to these different waveforms. So you see, using those different waveforms, there's quite a big sonic palette which you can achieve using either what note on the MIDI is being triggered, what kind of waveform is being generated, and then furthermore down the chain you've got various filters and effects which you can apply. So the way I kind of like to explain this is for traditional subtractive synthesis, what you're essentially doing is you're creating a full frequency sound, and then you're slowly subtracting frequencies from that, maybe using a filter or effects and that kind of stuff. So just for sound design, this is generally the easiest kind of synthesis method to wrap your head around, because it's kind of linear. You create a sound, you apply some effects, and you have a resulting sound. The other synthesis methods are a little bit more abstract and kind of tend to lean themselves more towards experimental stuff. But that being said, is you can always explore the rest of the videos on my channel to learn more about that kind of stuff. But let's look at the effect of applying a filter here. See, we're essentially subtracting an amount of frequencies from that original source, and you can choose what frequencies are being subtracted by this using this control here at the bottom. So there's various settings on a filter. You've got the kind of resonance amount, which kind of peaks a certain frequency, and then you have various different types of filters that either cut out the bottoms, cut out the tops, or just allow the middle frequencies through, and you can sweep those and stuff. So essentially, like I said, you're creating a full frequency sound, and you're using a filter to kind of like filter out certain frequencies. So here within Vital, you've got various different types of filters. Each has a kind of particular type of sound. So the next important step in synthesis is the modulations. So these are kind of like time-based events that are happening within the sound, and you can apply that event to create a difference in various different kind of parameters within the synth. If you want the pitch to change over time, or if you want any other parameter in the synth to change over time. So for this explanation, I'm going to use the pitch just because it's easiest to hear and easiest to kind of explain. And how we get a simple modulation going in Vital is you have these modulation generators along the right-hand side. So you've got envelopes, which are a trigger-based event, and then you have LFOs, which are a cycle-based event. So one of the more complex things about Vital is you can kind of set both to do both. You could have LFOs that don't loop and all sorts of stuff, but we're not going to get too technical in this video. So just for the purpose of this explanation, let's drag this LFO. You can just select this setting over here where you see this little diamond, and drag this onto this pitch control over here, which is just to the left of where you see it says pitch. And now if we hold down a MIDI note, we'll notice that it creates an event which modulates the pitch of the sound. So here you have the frequency, which determines the amount of time that it takes for one loop of this modulation to occur. And then you have a smooth setting. So this basically smooths the output of the modulation. So if you want a kind of more sine type of output, then you would use the smooth control over here. Just to give you guys a reference of what's happening here, we can draw in our own kind of specific shapes to create interesting modulations on this pitch. So we can click step over here, and then if we hold control, it allows us to actually draw in steps within this LFO. So there's so much control that you've got here. You don't necessarily have to apply this to the pitch. You can apply it to like a filter, for example. So let's enable the filter again. Let's remove the modulation from the pitch, and then let's apply the modulation to the filter. So to hear this a little bit better, we might have to choose a waveform that has a little bit more of a rich sound to begin with. So let's choose the saw wave again. And then you're not limited to just one modulation. You can drag this to various things within the patch. So you can just drag it and go wild and experiment, or you can kind of be more methodical if you have a certain sound in mind. And then you have more random generators. So for example, here we can set this to, I'm just going to choose a sine wave again. Let's set the random to modulate the pitch. So random's a really nice way of creating like a chaotic effect, and there's various different types of random that you can use. So Perlin is like a slightly more rounded, sample and hold is a kind of stepped one, and then various different other methods. Lorenz Attractor kind of has a almost UFO-like character to it. So that's cool if you're creating like alien noises and that kind of thing. Okay, so once we have our sound, we can look at applying effects. So just some things to kind of like bear in mind when coming at this from like a non-musical point of view. Things like delays and reverbs, I think will generally tend to add a kind of like either room-like tone to a sound, or a kind of like echo-like tone, which might throw things a little bit off when playing a game, because you might have, you know, different room effects being applied within the game engine or something like that. So these are things to take into account when using different effects. You might not want to apply reverb onto the actual sample. You might want to somehow create a sort of ambisonic thing within the game engine or something like that. Or you might not want to have echoes on your sound if you don't actually have a sound bouncing onto things. For example, you could actually generate that sort of bounce within the game engine. So anyway, I want to look at some of the more kind of like tonal based effects, stuff like chorus, flanger, phaser, distortion, and that kind of thing, because these are really nice ways of maybe adding a kind of metallic texture to a sound. So distortion essentially just overdrives the input. It just turns it up. But there's various like different kind of methods of distortion here. Downsample is really, really nice because it kind of gives it a digital kind of 8-bitty kind of tone that you can use to maybe take a sound and simulate something more of like an 8-bit kind of sound that might be suitable for the type of game that you're creating. So you can change the order of these effects. Say, for example, let's put a flanger on. This kind of adds a metallic texture to the sound. But we can choose, do we want the flanger before or after that kind of bit crushy distortion sound? Okay, so that goes a little bit crazy, but just a kind of quick reference of the kind of capabilities here. So let's just experiment with a couple of these other things here. And you can also modulate these controls within the effects. So we could, for example, send a modulation to the drive. Just to give you guys a quick reference of what the delay and reverb can do. So, I mean, that might be cool if you're trying to create like an ambient kind of texture in your track or something like that. But, you know, for more sound effects type of things, I would probably I'd probably stay away from delays and reverbs and that kind of thing, and then add those in the actual game engine. So this is a nice and easy tool for displaying the pitch of the sound. So as the pitch rises, you'll notice the readout over here goes higher and higher. And this will help for me to explain a very basic principle. You know, as you heard, as the pitch went lower, it was kind of lower in the frequency. As it went higher, it was higher in the frequency. So what we want to achieve is the idea of frequency separation between different elements within our game. So for example, with our background music, we don't want it to clash with our kind of alert sounds, like maybe gunshots or stuff actually happening in the scene of the game. So one way I've thought to, you know, counteract this is to create most of our sounds for alerts and that kind of thing within a very specific frequency band. So I've chosen to go with something like 1 to 3 kilohertz. So this doesn't necessarily mean the sounds can't exist below that, but I think this is the kind of basic frequency range that we want to kind of aim most of our alert sounds and that kind of thing to really be prominent in, and then we can kind of fill the rest of the frequency space with music and that kind of thing. So stuff like gunshots and explosions, which have a lot of low frequency, that's fine, as long as there's a lot of presence in the kind of 1 to 3 kilohertz range to really alert our brain to the fact that there's something going on. Another kind of little thing I want to explain to you guys is the frequency range between 1 and 3 kilohertz is where our brains are kind of most tuned to being very, very sensitive to, because this is the kind of frequency which we generally hear, you know, humans screaming, babies crying, and sort of other organic alert sounds that we would hear in the world. So we could use this to our advantage to, you know, because we know the human ear is kind of more in tune to this frequency range, we can use that range to kind of create our alert sounds and fill the rest of the space with ambient sounds and that kind of thing. And we can do a similar sort of thing with the dynamics of how we create these sounds. So the background track, I want to be not too transient, not too punchy, more kind of ambient and obscure, maybe a few kind of like percussion sounds, but those will be, you know, compressed and very processed dynamically, and the warning effects and gunshots can really punch through with transient in the mix. And I think that's going to help to separate our alert sounds and our warning sounds and our scene sounds from our background music. So the last thing I want to kind of talk about before getting into actually creating these sounds is the mood or the tone. And I think it's very important to kind of have a particular vibe in mind, or to kind of create a sort of mood board of a vibe that you want to achieve. And that way, you know, you'll much easier be able to tell if these sounds that you create either fit or don't fit, and you can kind of try something else or something like that. So for example, if you're creating a very high definition game, you don't necessarily want sounds that are 8-bit and vice versa. You can necessarily blur the lines between those two, but if that is the vibe that you're going for, you know, think about it beforehand, create a certain mood or tone, and try sort of create all of the sounds within that using the different tools at your disposal. And hopefully the rest of this video will try outline a bit more of that for you. Okay, I've got an initialized instance of Vital over here. I think the first thing I want to get into creating is a gunshot sound. Well, you know, as you guys saw, the game doesn't have a traditional gun, but you can use various of these techniques to create something closer to a gunshot. In this example, it's more of like an electronic zap kind of sound that I'm thinking I want to create. Something that a synth could create, like an overcharge of electricity or something like that. So here what we can do is we can set basic shapes sine wave to generate the tone. And what we want to do here is we want to use a modulation to quickly zap that pitch from a really high pitch to a low pitch. And so let's assign this LFO to the pitch. and then we can draw something in like this. So you'll notice that it cycles over and over again as you hold the key down. If you want the LFO to act more like an envelope, i.e. a trigger, what you do is you click envelope mode over here, and then it just cycles once. So the benefit of doing this with an LFO as opposed to an envelope is you have the control of drawing in a much more complex shape. So here you'll notice that the pitch of the sound is determined by the key, and we can actually turn that off in Vital. Over here in the advanced section we can click note track off, and now it's going to be a very specific frequency that we tune the oscillator to over here. So the different notes of the keyboard aren't changing the sound. And I think for sound effects it's pretty helpful to do this kind of thing, because you don't necessarily want to remember what key or what note it sounded the best at. You kind of just want a static pitch to always be triggered, you know, for an explosion or a gunshot or that kind of thing. So you'll notice there's a bit of a kind of ramp up towards that peak of the envelope, and that's because of the smooth parameter. So if we turn this down all the way to 0, we'll notice a much more snappy effect. So here I'm just going to fine tune it. We can turn the pitch like a lot lower so we can get like a more boomy effect as it snaps down, and then maybe turn the amount of modulation up. So the trick here for getting kind of a more organic sound is to not have as much of a programmed kind of envelope. We could, you know, draw something a little bit more unique in like this. Cool, that sounds good. So if we want to, you know, filter out some of that really high pitch that's coming through, we can use a filter. And let's just apply less resonance so it doesn't have that sharp peak at the top. And then we can just use this cutoff frequency to kind of determine the point at which we want to start cutting off that frequency of the top. And we can also get a different LFO to actually modulate this. Let's set this to an envelope as well. And then we can also draw in something unique over here. So in Vital you have various effects over here. Harmonic stretch is pretty interesting, although it doesn't work on sine waves. Phase disperse also doesn't work on sine waves. So you're not limited to just one generator within a synthesizer. You've got various different oscillators which generate the tone. Each one can have like a different wave shape, but you can also stack an oscillator alongside like a noise generator, which you can have like a sample or something loaded in there. For now, let's just stick with the traditional white noise. So with this kind of thing, I like to modulate the actual parameter here, so we could use one of the ones that exist already. And if we want to apply this to the filter as well, we can click this little SMP button that sends the sampler through the filter as well. Okay, let's apply some effects. That's sounding nice. I think this first LFO might be a little bit sharp. We can use the smooth control to change that a bit. And then finally, we can apply some envelope to the actual final output. So we can apply a little bit of attack to kind of reduce the amount of like transient that the sound has. Okay, so that's good enough for now. It is actually doing like a nice thing at a higher frequency. So I'm just going to turn this up by an octave. Oh, that's nice. Okay, so let's turn the sustain and release down a little bit just so it doesn't carry on for that long. Cool, that sounds good. So I can always come back and edit that. So let's just start organizing the project a little bit. This one's called Gunshot. I'm going to create a folder here. Call this one sound effects. We can create another folder, which I'm going to start creating the background stuff, music and stuff. That's going to be in a later episode though. And we can just start creating other sounds. We can use placeholders and always just come back and see, you know, what suits the vibe. So I want to create a sound for when the bullet hits the enemy. So like a metallic clang kind of sound. And my favorite way of doing that is using FM. So this is a little bit more of a kind of complex synthesis method, but it's super easy within Vital. Let's just set basic shapes. Let's select another oscillator. Let's select basic shapes. And then here on oscillator 2, let's just turn the level down. And then on oscillator 1, let's go and set FM from oscillator 2. So here, let's jump into the advanced and just turn note tracking off for both of these oscillators. Because we're creating sound effect stuff, we don't necessarily need it to be too musical. So it doesn't sound like much now, but when you start changing these frequencies here, specifically when you start to get values that aren't like divisible by 12, so when it's not a perfect octave, you get these really complex, weird kind of waveforms. So here the trick is to use like an envelope to create like a sort of percussive sound here. Okay, let's create a sound for when the player gets damaged. And I think for this, what could be cool is to look at Vital's text-to-wavetable. So what this does is it allows you to input text. So let's say, for example, ouch. And it uses this to create, it basically synthesizes speech sound and loads it as a wavetable. And what a wavetable is little audio chunks and the ability to kind of sweep through these. So if we set up a modulator to cycle through these, let's listen to the effect. Then let's set this to modulate like this, and again set this to envelope mode, and then it'll modulate just once. It's attempting to recreate a kind of speech sample of what we've punched in there. And we can turn this pitch down to kind of like fine tune it a little bit.
Ouch. 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 Ouch.
So here we can go set the smooth, and we can change this frequency to change the speed.
Ouch. 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 Ouch.
Okay, so I also want to create a sound that's kind of like a reload or like a power-up sound for the gun, because the gun kind of like takes a few seconds to actually blast around. So I'm thinking of creating something using like a noise sample and then pitching it up to like a midpoint. And this HVAC unit is actually a really nice sample that's built in here. It's kind of got like almost like a real machine type of tone to it. So what I want to do here is let's create like a modulation, like an envelope, something like this, to get us to like the midpoint. Cool, so now what we can do is we can go in and start rendering these sounds out into samples. So what I want to do is I actually want to put each one into its own folder, just to kind of keep the original synthesizer in case we want to jump back and edit things in the actual preset that we created. So here what I want to do is then render this out. So I've got the audio file as well as the actual synthesizer. If I want to go back there, I can mute that. And now we can actually work on the actual sample itself. So there's various things we can do with the actual sample. We can pitch it up, pitch it down, and do all sorts of stuff to kind of fine tune it. We can stretch it out, make it smaller, all sorts of things. The other benefit now of keeping things in folders is we can start to layer, other sound effects, like other samples and stuff. We don't necessarily have to synthesize everything. We can start layering sound effects and stuff from a collection that we may have, or we can start to, layer in stuff that we've synthesized, or, anything. So here what I'm going to do is just play around with like layering extra stuff to kind of like embellish this gunshot effect that we created. So another really cool feature inside Vital for this kind of thing is this quantized pitch capabilities. Let me just set this to basic shapes, square wave. We can go for this kind of like old school 8-bit kind of sound. And let's, for example, just put in a C of the quantize. And then if we set a modulation on the pitch, what's going to happen is it's always going to snap to a C, depending on like within certain octave. So that's a nice way of creating these kind of like, very sort of more system kind of sounds for like picking up items and that kind of thing. I used it to create this kind of like respawn and item pickup sound. And the last thing is a jump sound effect. So this is just very simple, like a shape like this, a modulation. And this is applied to various parameters like the pitch, and then various parameters here for effects. That's about it for the sort of synthesis and generation section. Now I'm just going to go in and layer things with samples and process and just kind of see how it goes here. And now with just a couple of those sound effects loaded into the engine, the level of immersion just feels so much better. When that explosion hits, the screen shakes, you actually feel that kind of rumble. The experience is already just so much better. Anyway, in case you hadn't noticed, that's me, got a little synth, and I'm shooting sine waves at these evil capacitors. That's basically the concept. So anyway, awesome. That's about it for this episode. Hope you guys enjoy that. Stick around for the next one. I'm definitely going to do a follow-up on this, doing the background music and a couple of other interesting things that you can think about before programming into, your sort of game sound design and music soundtracks. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you haven't yet, consider hitting that subscribe button, and yeah, hit that like button as well. See you guys next time. Cheers.